You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled "No One Could Handle the Emperor's Baby Dragons," until a human nurse tried something brilliant. HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The imperial palace of Tarthrian was built to make silence bleed. Sound did not live here. It shattered on basalt pillars and crawled away. The floors were obsidian rivers locked in time, polished by the weight of 1,000 years of Dracari claws. Banners the size of buildings hung like thunder. Courtyards were cut from cooled lava and rimmed with teeth of stone. Nothing in this place was gentle, and nothing in it bent unless it was to draw breath for fire. On the 7th day after the eclipse, that fortress began to tremble from a sound no warrior could bear. The heirs had hatched. 4 eggs the size of siege engines had split open under the watch of priests, alchemists, and an army of terrified attendants. The ancient rite had been perfect. The gold of the inlays had sung at the right pitch. The lava channels had flowed in the proper sequence. The emperor's blood had been offered on the ruby rock, a streak of star-black crimson burning smoke as it fell. All of it had worked, and the shells had broken like planets cracking. And then the screaming started. It was not a roar. Roars are proud. This was the shriek of brand new lungs emptying terror into air they did not yet trust. The sound punched through iron, rattled teeth inside skulls, made even the oldest Dracari warriors twitch. More than sound lived inside it. There was panic, hunger, loneliness, heat with no comfort, and the wild, blind fury of being alive. Servants stumbled out of the nursery with burned hands and wet faces, too ashamed to call it tears. Priests retreated whispering that their gods had never prepared them for this. Healers tasted soot and fear. The head of servants, scaled, scarred, steady, came out with smoke curling from the edges of her mouth, eyes wide in a face that could count 3 centuries. "Majesty," she said, voice cracking, "they are beyond us." Emperor Cathraz the Endless stood in the doorway, a darkness that made fire look thin. His crest of knives lifted as he listened to his children's pain. He was vast even by Dracari measure, scaled in star iron, eyes like furnaces behind glass. He wore nothing but a cloak of black chains and the scars of 1,000 victories. In all his storied reign, no enemy had broken him. Now he did not step forward. He could not. "They hunger," he said. The word came out like a boulder thrown into a volcano. "They refuse meat. They refuse plasma gel. They refuse heat pearls," said the head of servants. "They refuse handling." The consort, she of the burning moon, stood beside him with shoulders squared into agony. In her face was something the court had never seen, helplessness. "They bite the air," she breathed, "as if it has wronged them." Cathraz's claws carved a groove in stone. "Find a being who understands infants." "We have sent for 50, said the head. 60. One from every allied species. They fail or flee. "Send further," Cathraz said, and the order fell through the empire like a hammer. Messengers relayed the impossible, and replies came in at the speed of fear. The palace became a revolving door for the great. The Yevon brooded with their scent bells, their chorus failed and burned. The Catril brought salt vapors and shadow nets. The hatchlings tore shadow apart and spat fire on the nets. A dairy priestess injected dream milk. One hatchling screamed so hard the glass in the dome whipped like water and fell. A Vry physician wore rain in her hair, walked in singing to the memory of oceans, and came out with her voice gone, ribs fractured, standing on will alone. On the edge of the 7th night, with no stars showing through the storm of the planet's auroras, a human transport set down in the subsidiary courtyard with engines whispering apology. Humans had been in the Imperium for not quite a century, allowed near the heart less because of love and more because humans did what other species avoided. They cared in the dark. They were spindly, soft, annoying with their stubborn optimism, and infamous for doing work no one wanted because it was painful or small. They also had a habit of not dying when they should, which the Dracari catalogued as useful and unnerving. From the transport stepped a human in a plain white uniform with a gray satchel on her hip. No armor, no weapon, no jewelry. She had strong hands that had learned restraint and a voice that could find softness even inside alarms. Her hair was tied back in a simple knot. A faded thread bracelet hugged her wrist. She bowed neatly as Dracari etiquette required, and when she straightened she looked not at the throne, not at the banners, but at the nursery door as if she could feel the pain beating behind it. "I am Mara Chen," she said. Her voice was smoke-smoothed from long shifts in recycled air. "I'm a neonatal nurse. I came as fast as I could." The chamber rumbled with draconic disapproval cut by curious silence. Humans said that silence, fragile, breakable, foolish. "You will be incinerated," warned the consort. It was not contempt, it was grief weaponized into caution. "Maybe," Mara said. She adjusted the satchel strap, a small human habit in a room built to kill. "But I know crying like that. Give me 3 hours." Cathraz leaned forward and the air pressure shifted. 3 hours, he agreed. "Anything you need." "A temperature-stable space beyond the primary heat surge," she said. "Audio permission. Long-handled ladles of heat-proof alloy, something like a hook, and a way to measure oxygen, your equivalent. No one else in the room except the children, and no shouting through the door." "You will not touch them," said the consort. Mara's mouth tilted. "I won't need to." The court murmured with disbelief. Humans soothed with hands, one minister hissed. "What else do they have?" At that, Mara glanced at the ceiling as if listening for someone only she could hear. Then she touched the faded thread on her wrist with 2 careful fingers. "Heartbeat," she said. The nursery door opened for her with a snarl of seals and a flare of heat that peeled moisture from eyes. Air rushed out like the exhale of a forge. The guards flinched back. Mara stepped through. Within was an elemental storm trying to become a room. The heat shimmered in sheets. Lava light played along gold and black stones. 4 hatchlings, massive for infants, monstrous to human senses, thrashed in their cradles of tempered alloy. Their scales were not yet armor, but light, thin plates drifting on fire, flexing with each breath. Their wings were half-remembered plans pressed into flesh. Their eyes were sunstruck coins with a horizon of night. They howled. The sound came with bright threads of blue that burned a lattice into the air. Mara's ears filled with pressure, and she felt her knees soften under a wave of something older than fear, the body's plea to flee. She swallowed and counted backwards from 10 to 1, like she'd taught 100 frightened parents to do in rooms that smelled like plastic and effort. She set her satchel down. Her hands moved with deliberate economy. From it she drew an old earth music box, square, scuffed, dented from too many deployments. Its spring was half-worn, its cover painted with a field of stars whose corners were rubbed to nothing. She set it on the floor where the stone gave her a little patch of cool from the heat's convective dance. Then she did something that made the guards outside jerk toward the door before remembering their orders. She sat down. Cross-legged on the floor of the hottest room in the Empire, the human nurse wound the key. The tiny gears turned. The first notes came out thin and brave. It was a lullaby without language that had traveled across oceans on a planet called Earth, then through stations and ships from hands to ears, lost and found again until it learned to live in the spaces humans made for hope. It did not promise safety. It promised presence. "I am here," it said. "I am here even when everything else is not." The hatchlings reacted as if gravity had shifted. Their heads swung. Fire paused in their throats. Claws stilled mid-scratch, scraping half-moons glowing into cooling metal. 4 pairs of 2 young eyes tracked a sound that cared nothing for ages or species. Mara listened with them and hummed under the notes. Her voice was low, a thread under threads. "I am here." One of the dragonlings, smallest, round-bellied, scales bright as coins in fresh water, hiccuped a bubble of blue fire and blinked at the box with devastating suspicion. Another, long of neck, black mottled under gold, tilted his head and made a small, involuntary coo that no warrior would speak of afterward and no one could forget. The two larger hatchlings pulled their wings tighter. The pitch of their protest slipped down a notch. Mara kept humming. When she breathed, she made sure to show it. Exaggerated but natural, slow, even. A metronome the body's oldest parts recognized. She kept her hands on her knees, palms up, fingers open. No threat, no grabbing, no rush, time bent. She felt sweat trickle, the air burned the back of her throat. The music grew quieter as the spring unwound towards silence. When it died, she did not reach to rewind. She let silence arrive with escort. She hummed the last note into nothing. The smallest hatchling chirped once question. The black-mottled one flattened his ears and leaned toward the box. The other two breathed in time, not with battle drum but with her lungs. Mara reached with a long ladle, slow, predictable, so slow it hurt, and dipped it into the nutrient gel resting in the heat cup built by palace alchemists. It was identical in chemistry to what half a dozen species had used for their own powerful young, and utterly unacceptable to Dracari hatchlings if delivered wrong. She lifted the ladle, gel moving like a broken star. She rested the ladle's tip on the lip of one cradle, then lowered it until a heavy drop fell plop onto the warm, fire-slick tongue. The smallest hatchling made a sound like a forge accepting iron. He swallowed. He waited, eyes locked on her hand. Another drop, another swallow. He did not lash. He did not hiss. He reached his face toward the long handle with terrifying gentleness. Mara's vision wavered with relief. "There you go," she whispered, a human phrase that works on babies and engines and sometimes kings. Another ladle, slow, predictable. She fed them in turns, small, black-mottled next. The one with a nick along his left horn snorted gel back at her once and made a noise that sounded like a very small insult, which she ignored. The largest studied her as if she were a new star and took his drop at the third offering, grudging, disbelieving the idea of being okay and submitting to it anyway. The room's temperature sank from death to survivable. The guards outside sagged against the door in uncomprehending relief. The consort cried with soundless discipline that hurt the chest to see. The emperor lowered his head for the first time in an uncounted age because his children were eating. When Mara emerged 3 hours later, she looked like a woman boiled and then set in a draft. Her hair stuck to her forehead. The whites of her eyes were red rims. She held the music box as one holds a relic earned by pain. "They will live," she said, and realized her voice was a rasp that would cost her tomorrow. "They need feeding by rhythm, not by volume. They need sound that does not change suddenly. They need presence that is calm. No touching, not yet. They are all nerve and heat. Give me access to the room and this." She lifted the music box. "Record these sounds and play them when I sleep." The consort, eyes burning clean, bowed to the human bowed, and the palace tilted on its axis. "You will have all that you ask." Cathrez's voice had no words for gratitude, so he used truth. "You did what power could not," he said. "You found a door that was not there." Mara's smile was tired and instinctively contradictory, the way humans smiled when they were about to cry or faint or argue with a doctor. "No," she said. "I found a heartbeat. Babies understand heartbeat before they understand anything else." He stared at her for a long fraction of his long life and decided to place something without price in her hands. "You have the heart of the Empire, human. Do not let it go out." "I won't," she said, "because absolute statements are all humans have when the fire starts." The palace learned new ways to move around sound. Attendants were trained not to clear throats in the corridors near the nursery. Priests learned to hum in minor modes. Guards were rotated for quiet feet. A protocol was written that had never been written in a world of war: how to enter gently. A red strip on the floor showed how close one could approach without being burned. The strip changed with their moods, and Mara knew to the millimeter when to stop. Days became weeks. Weeks became a measure of breath and song. The hatchlings grew, which is to say their needs changed with a cruel speed that would have killed any caregiver not addicted to adaptability. They learned to turn their heads toward sounds they liked and away from ones they hated. They learned that feeding came with notes, that pain came with silence, that fear could be interrupted with breath. They learned to wait after seeing the ladle, which the palace wrote into a law about self-control and discipline, but Mara recognized as the miracle it was, trust. She named them privately and never aloud. Smallest became Little Coin. Black-mottled was Night Sand. The nick-horned one she called Scar Promise. The largest was River Heat. The names lived only in her chest because they were not hers to give. The Emperor came at hours that made the palace shake. War Council ended. A dozen systems moved a fraction. A slave planet emancipated or not based on a look, and stood behind the glass window no longer fogged by steam. He listened to a lullaby like rain drumming on a roof he would never need. You are different with them than with other humans I have seen with their young. He observed one night when the moons were red eyes out beyond the clouds. He said it as a question disguised as a statement, the way proud rulers ask for help. Mara rubbed a hand under her jaw and did not flinch at the warlord who could bite suns. I am the same, she said, but they are stronger, which means I must be calmer. Is it true that human infants cannot breathe fire? The consort's mouth twitched with black humor, such a new expression on such an old face that 3 ministers fainted at the sight earlier that day. Mara's laugh lived on the edge of collapse. No fire, she said, but they make a kind of storm just being alive. We learn to hold umbrellas while it rages. Umbrellas, repeated Cathraz, honoring a word he did not understand as he'd once honored an enemy blade. We will forge some. They did. Dracari smiths asked for the dimensions of an idea and then made it from star iron. Umbrella became ritual, a series of concentric sound shields that could be opened in sequence to reduce noise shock when something clanged or a door slammed or a warrior roared by reflex and joy. The palace learned to open umbrellas before walking near the nursery. They learned to say we are coming at the door. They learned to wait for silence, not to force it. Care restructured a war machine. The ministers called it weakness in private. Then the heart's wrath began, and the palace learned the weight of softness. The heart's wrath was a storm that the oldest Dracari books described as a god forgetting to be gentle. The planet's core rolled and heaved. The magnetospheres tangled in their own ropes. The northern auroras rained flaming curtains. Stone sweated. Metal sang. The nursery's temperature alarms went off in 8 languages. Gaskets squirmed and failed. Air molecules ran to each other and became heat. The hatchlings, now large enough to dwarf prisoners' wagons, screamed without music and lit the room into white. The glass blistered. The attendants fell into their training and did not rush in or shout or panic, because the human had put new laws in their bones. Mara's heat suit was a cobbled thing. Palace tech glued to ship salvage, human straps threaded through Dracari buckles. She ran like a person whose body had already been spent and had to be mortgaged. She keyed the door with hands shaking. She opened the umbrellas in her mind, one by one, as her heart tried to kick out of her chest and take refuge on the cool floor. Then she went in. She had never seen light so hungry. It chewed the edges of her vision and made the room look like the inside of a blade being sharpened. The hatchlings smashed their cradles into the walls and the walls into scents. Fire pooled on the floor, went to boil, then to steam, then back to fire because physics forgot how to behave. Her music box would melt, her comm would melt, her suit would melt and her skin would go next. Songs survive heat better than metal, so she used the first instrument and last refuge, her voice. "I am here," she sang, and the words baked dry on her tongue. She sang the old lullaby wrong, and it did not matter. Notes fell off cliffs and landed limping and choked, but they kept moving. She sang breath into their panic. She sang predictable rhythms into a room where nothing had a pattern. She sang the pauses on purpose, because bodies learn pauses faster than words. She did not try to drown their screams. She braided her thread through them until the rope held their weight. Little Coin collapsed first, shock sucking oxygen out of his little body that was no longer little at all. She crawled on gloves that smoked and hooked the ladle toward his mouth. The metal softened under her hand, and she cursed a word of love. Night Sand's fire hit the ceiling and came down in a spray. Scar Promise clawed the air as if to tear breath from it. River Heat smashed his cradle open and stood wild and massive, a son that had learned legs and screamed like grief. Mara turned her back to River Heat because she trusted what she had taught, and because when a mountain yells, you answer with backbone. She kept singing. She pressed the ladle's molten end to Little Coin's tongue. "There you go," she said, and the phrase cracked, and her voice split, and she kept going. Time folded inside Heat. The world narrowed to sounds she made, and how those sounds changed the flames that were children. She made her chest move slow even as sparks bit through her suit and kissed her ribs. Sweat steamed off of her before it existed. She took one breath too deeply, and the heat went into her lungs like knives. She coughed, and the cough tasted of stars dying. Then something changed. A harmony entered, raw and wrong and beautiful. River Heat pulled his anger inside him in one brutal wrench of self and found the note she was holding and matched it. Dragons do not harmonize, they fight. They burn, they roar. He matched it. The others fell in, not as music understands, but as bodies do, timing. Night Sand's breath hitched on the offbeat with hers. Scar Promise cut his screams between her phrases and did not know that he was learning to leave room for someone else. Little Coin's tail beat a slow, steady 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. The temperature dropped. Her visor unfogged. The air remained a knife, but a smaller one. The white glare dimmed toward gold. The storm outside clawed and clawed until it tired and finally slunk away across the horizon. When the doors opened again and the first sweep of cool air slid in around her burned legs, Mara realized she was lying on the floor with her cheek on stone. 4 dragons curled in a loose circle around her, heads on heavy claws, eyes shut. After that day, the palace did not whisper about weakness again. It learned a new word, dependence. Not the chain kind. The kind that says your life belongs to the life next to you, and that is not a failing but a design. Mara healed slowly. Human skin makes new parts if you ask it hard enough and give it time. The palace healers were brilliant and terrible. They wanted to clone her voice, map her patterns, bottle her lullabies, weaponize her breath. The emperor did not let them cut her into a resource. He posted guards with pikes taller than she was and told the court in a growl that shook each pillar, "If harm comes to the human, I will tear this palace down to the tiles and feed it to my children." They believed him. They also believed her. When she came on her feet again with a new thinness around her mouth and a limp that declared bills unpaid, she returned to work because there was nothing else to do. The dragons had grown. Adolescent now, their scales were plating up into armor, their wings had learned appetite, and their fire could decide its own color. They came to the glass when she approached. They pressed their foreheads to the barrier with such care it made old warriors rub their throats. She hummed without thinking, and their shoulders dropped. Court became a theater of uneasy miracles. Delegations arrived and saw 4 massive weapons sit down when a human nurse lifted a finger. They watched emperors pause at doors because a sleeping dragon lay behind and footsteps might wake him. They watched soldiers, men and women who could lift boulders, learn to carry buckets with the grace of thieves so as not to splash. They watched a war world lowered to a hush because in that hush lay the empire's future. Humans began to be called for softer work in hard places. A ship where reactors howled. Send a human with a song. A prison colony where the ground cracked under sun. Send a human with shade. The other species began to copy this without admitting it. The Dracari did not copy. They adopted. Through the softening, war marched. It always does. Power is a tide that resents any delay. The Vral Consortium had counted Dracari fire and decided that numbers could drown it. Insectoid minds with 1,000 hands drew plans. They built black ships thin as regret and sharp as hunger. They tuned sonic weapons to rip where armor was irrelevant. They came with an army that could have smothered constellations if constellations had breath to smother. The Dracari launched to meet them. The Empire became a drum. The children, no longer children, unfolded wings that cast cities into night and joined the sky. Flotillas rose in wedges, spears of light speared light. The void filled with terrible flowers, the Vral weapon fired. To human ears it would have sounded like a razor against bone. To Dracari it was iron in the mouth, acid in the eye socket, grief stuffed into lungs. It took the shape of their ancestors' last breaths and twisted them hard. The dragons reeled. One screamed with a sound no human could carry and fell from a height that made stone wince. Another clutched air and beat at it like a drowning soldier beating at black water. In cockpits and command pits, Dracari folded forward and roared just to have a sound of their own, and not the one the Vral was feeding them. In the command tower, the tactical display turned into a harvest of loss. Red flared and flared. The ministers shouted orders like prayers and got static back. The Emperor set his hands on the rail and waited for a thing that could not arrive. The old power, the old answer, the old victory. Mara was in the room where the palace had given her a bed, because they could not get her to sleep if they called it her quarters. Her body told her what the weapon did before the alarms did. She curled without intending to, palms to ears, a soundless cry on her tongue. She had heard babies make that sound. She had made it once in an airlock when the power failed and the oxygen ran low and 3 tiny lives tried to cloud her vision so she would not see them leave. She stood and nearly fell. She reached for the music box and her hand touched the thread on her wrist instead. She took it all the way off and laid it on the bed and did not notice that it hurt like something tender being cut. She moved toward the one place sound could go for help, the comms nest. She did not ask permission. A Dracari officer stood in her way like a mountain. She stared up at him until his knees remembered who had left their pattern in them and he moved aside with a choke. The comms engineer had 7 hands and all of them failed at once when the human took a microphone. No, he snapped, desperate because terror made him stupid. You will ruin the nets. I will mend them, she said, and the truth in her tone ached the air. She did not wait for a channel. She opened the main line, the one coded to reach every ship, every pilot, every dragon, every soldier with a receiver in his skull. She held the microphone with burned hands. She took one breath that had to last and began to sing. It was a lullaby, but no longer small. She put into it the day she had looked into a plastic incubator on a dust moon and seen a creature the size of her hand fight an entire universe. She put into it the storm that had tried to cook her and the 4 heads that had lowered to her song. She put into it an old earth rain that had never fallen on this planet and never would. She put into it the voice of a woman who had learned to sing while her bones shook and who did not stop because shaking is not the opposite of strength. Out in the slaughter-black sky, the note hit a dragon's ear. That dragon was night sand, once black mottled, now a sweep of midnight under gold. He had fire in his throat and static in his brain and a sound in his bones that was trying to turn him inside out. The note cut through like a single clear step on a staircase no one knew was there. He took the step. He breathed on her rhythm. The Vral weapon clawed at his nerves and found fewer places to stick. He took another step. River Heat heard it next, and something original to him rose like a tide to meet it, fury braided to tenderness, strong in contradiction. He lowered his head in the hurricane of noise and matched her pitch, as if matching a promise he had been waiting to keep since his first breath. The vral frequencies wavered. Scar Promise found the gaps and pressed his breath there. He made his airflow into a shield and learned to shape the transition between inhale and exhale into an answer against a weapon built from math and malice. Little coin, smallest still by a hair and always most stubborn. This was his moment. He found joy in the sound. He laughed a dragon's laugh which breaks stone with happiness. He laughed into the weapon and the weapon flinched because it had never been built to tolerate joy. One dragon turned, then two, then four, then the flight, then the fleet. In ships and cockpits and in the open terrifying sky, soldiers syncopated breathing. Pilots moved hands in time. A commander somewhere who had never been rocked to sleep in her life felt tears and did not despise them, and reached out and put her palm on an officer's shoulder not for command but for contact. And the officer did not die of confusion. Whole squadrons found their rhythm and rode it like a river. The vral weapon screeched and shifted frequencies, and found the Dracari not standing still as they had assumed but moving in pattern. And pattern eats noise if you feed it hard. The dragons changed direction as one being and cut through the vral the way a good idea cuts through despair. Fire went blue. Lines of ships that had been smug became sections of a map melting. The vral do not scream, their mouth parts cannot. Their message traffic became a hot needle of error. In the command tower, Cathraz had never looked more like his name, and his name was Old Mountain with blood under it. He stood without moving while his court swayed under a wave that was not heat, and not sound but something that made warriors wish for their mothers and priests wish they had one. He looked at the human holding the microphone as if there might be a god after all. He did not weep. He laughed once short, a cracking sound, because a dragon out there laughed, and he had not heard that since the day under the storm when he learned he could love a prey creature more than victory. The battle lasted through a day and a night that were both bright with fire. The vral broke on the third push. They left in pieces. They left a message full of static and disappointment and rage, and did not send another. The palace threw a celebration that nearly broke the Lullaby laws. Mara attended with a scarf around her throat and a shock in her eyes that recognized victory, and also knew that everyone who wants to keep children alive pays for victory later. She stood on a balcony and watched dragons roll in warm columns of air like snakes of light. She felt two presences come up beside her and did not turn until she had finished a breath all the way to the bottom. The consort's scales shone with oil and battle dust, and the buffalo softness that comes when danger retracts its teeth and lets you lick its bloody lips. She bowed again. "You carry us," she said, and the sentence had 1,000 nuances that all meant gratitude that would last longer than stone. Cathraz did not bow. He placed one huge claw on the rail and said, "You have saved this empire twice. Nothing I have can match what you have given. Name what you want." Mara thought of sleep. She thought of a human ward somewhere with windows and the sound of rain that was just recycled water pretending. She thought of a small kitchen where coffee remembered it had once been a ritual and not a drug. She thought of a bed with a thread bracelet on the pillow next to her. She also thought of dragons asleep with their heads on each other's tails. She thought of soldiers breathing in time. She thought of a palace opening umbrellas over a nursery door. Humans do not choose between these if they can help it. They choose both until their bodies say no. "I want 3 things," she said. First, protections in law for the soft. Any infant of any species born under your banner gets care before anything else, no matter what their parents owe you or what war you are fighting. Put it in your code with teeth. Second, I want a room with a window. She smiled without looking at the emperor because insolence is a spice, and he had enough flavor in his mouth already. Third, I want to teach your attendants to do what I do so that if I am sleeping or gone or dead, the lullabies do not end. You will not die, Cathres said with the certainty of a tyrant and the cowardice of a father. Everyone dies, Mara said gently. What matters is what survives our voices. He made it law. The code of the soft was carved into the basalt slabs that held up the throne room. There was a ceremony with blood and bells and a professor of ancient etiquette who went home and whispered the lullaby to himself before sleeping and did not tell his wife because he had never whispered before and felt shy about it. Mara got a room with a window cut through 3 meters of stone. The view was terrible and perfect, a slice of sky with a flag's edge in it. She could see weather coming. She could imagine rain. Training began. Training had to be invented. They had spear drills and flame forms and armor locks. Now they added breath exercises. They added the art of the pause. They added the protocol of the hand that does not touch. A Dracari guard with shoulders like doors learned to set down a ladle without clang. An attendant who had not slept a full night in 10 years learned to stand on 1 foot and breathe from her belly. Priests wrote new liturgies that included silence between stanzas and discovered that gods like silence as much as praise. A courier with ink on his claws delivered a message to a barracks and found himself crooning the opening of the lullaby to a soldier losing a friend to memory, and the soldier did not break the courier's jaw with gratitude. He just leaned on him a while. Mara aged because time keeps score even when you cheat. The dragons grew into majesty. They took names that mattered to their people and the empire. Kaler of the night wind, night sand grown tall. Rith of the 5 rivers, river heat made a map. Shem with the scar of truth, scar promise whose horn nick became a badge. And Zai coin of light, little coin who never became anything but joy weaponized. They flew beyond the palace and learned to roost in mountains like gods drowsing. They returned when Mara called. They took the fight to the consortium when the Vral came back with new cruelty. They made new traditions, battle preludes hummed under breaths, victory songs that did not sting their own like knives. Times of peace arrived in broken pieces and were assembled by hands not used to gentleness. The code of the soft changed the way taxes were collected and how prisons were run. A judge in a red city on a black moon read from it and set a woman free to feed her infant while giving the empire the work of her hands in a way that did not break her back. A governor on a gas skimmer recited the code to a warlord who had never believed in law and watched his face discover it. A ship captain under a sky with no planets in it put a cradle on a rack made for guns. Mara did not stop long enough to watch these. She was there and gone. Her window room held a few books, a plant that refused to die because human stubbornness had rubbed off on its leaves, a music box retired to a place of honor. The thread bracelet hung on a nail. She did not put it back on. She would touch it sometimes and think of her mother on a blue planet telling a smaller hand, "This string holds the sun when you can't." Some nights she dreamed of Earth and woke to dragons humming with her through the wall. Some days she stepped wrong and her leg remembered the storm and told her that bones have long memories. She laughed with kitchen staff who learned to sing while chopping. She sat with the consort through an illness that would have killed any smaller being and watched the emperor's hands shake because large bodies can break too. She stood beside Cathres on the balcony and felt the ache of his age like cold. He said once, "If I had found you 70 years ago, I would have conquered differently." And she answered, "If you had found a lullaby 70 years ago, you might have conquered less." He did not throw her off the balcony. He laughed without sound and let the wind wipe his eyes. War did not end. It grew teeth in new mouths. The Vral made a quiet pact with something in a dark region and returned with void minds that ate light. The Dracari lost a city on a sea world, and 3 cracks opened in the Emperor's control before he sealed them with will. The dragons flew until their scales turned dull, and the palace learned to pour oil on them without being burned. Humans came from further out with new lullabies learned in different darks. A miner sang a rhythm that matched the noise of drills and soothed fear during cave-ins. A shuttle medic carried a 3-note pattern that stopped panic in vacuum suits. One day, 10 years after the first battle with the Vral, a ship so large it crowded the sky arrived without hailing. It shattered 3 satellites before the 4th learned to hide. It sat in orbit like a threat counted out loud. It broadcast nothing. It drew lines in gravity that made the tide forget which way to go. Cathraz prepared to speak with it and prepared to fight if speaking failed and prepared to die if fighting failed. And then he remembered the nursery and the human and said to his council, "Before we do anything, breathe." He waited while a room of murderers inhaled for 4 counts and exhaled for 6 and repeated it twice, and everyone who wrote histories later had to pretend that he did not. The ship finally spoke. It was not Vral. It was not a species in any book. It spoke as if it used radio as a knife, cutting the signal into ears whether they were open or not. It asked the oldest question in the ugliest way: who owns this? Mara was not in the tower. She was in the nursery creche that was nursery in name only. The dragons did not fit in it anymore, but they came when they were wounded to lay their heads on stone that remembered their first breaths. Night Wind lay there now, a wound through his wing glistening like oil and pain cutting the edges of his pupils. She ran a hand over the air above the membrane, too old to pretend touch would not help and too practiced not to respect fire. She hummed and counted the beats between his winces. When the strange ship spoke, Night Wind's breath hitched in an old rhythm, fear talking to fear across a decade. "No," Mara whispered, without any authority to say it and with all the authority that mattered. "Not here." The palace did not answer the ship's ugly question with a roar. It answered with a lullaby. The comms officer, a woman who had not yet forgiven her body for needing rest, opened the line and sent out the song that had saved them and all the songs since. She sent them weakness made law. She sent them a map made of pauses. She sent them a ruler's open hands. The ship did not understand. It pressed its knife against the city's edge. Mara stood and felt a human thing rise that is older than fire and deeper than war, the refusal to abandon a cradle. She picked up the microphone at Night Wind's bedside. She did not ask for a channel. She sang to the ugly question as if it was a baby that did not know its own name. The ship replied with a weapon that bent the palace towers like reeds and slammed them back before they could break. The dragons rose in pain and fury. Cathraz moved as if he could bite space. The battle that followed would be carved into statues. It would be argued over by scholars whose hands shook when they talked about kindness. It would be whispered about by children under blankets. It would be sung by soldiers with their heads on each other's shoulders, the rocking making a rhythm of its own. It lasted 3 days in local time. It killed many things that could not be replaced. It made the palace bleed into the streets and the streets into the old lava beds, and the lava beds into the story no one wants to tell. The part where you run out of clever and you have to use care as a weapon because there is nothing else left to lift. Mara sang until her voice stopped, and then she mouthed the notes and the dragons knew them anyway. The code protected babies while the sky fell. Attendants carried incubators through fire shadows with umbrellas over them, because once a symbol becomes true, you never let go. On the 3rd day, the ship learned. It learned that breath in rhythm is harder to break than bone. It learned that lullabies build bridges inside brains, and brains on bridges do not fall as easily. It learned that a human nurse can outlast an empire if she has to. It learned that Dracari rage mated to tenderness births something more dangerous than either alone. It turned away with a message that was not a surrender and not a threat and not a prayer. It was a silence that said we will be back when we can do this without feeling. The palace stood with pieces missing that would never be put back. The code of the soft had pages burned by sparks that fell and were stomped out by hands and feet that still hurt. The dragons lay in lopsided piles, sleeping with mouths open to pull in enough air. The emperor sat on a step because he could not stand. Mara lay on her back on the floor in the creche and looked at her window from here. They had wheeled her bed into the room because moving her would break something, and saw a sliver of sky and a flag edge waving, and she cried exactly once quietly with her face still and her eyes leaking. Recovery takes longer than war. The palace learned how to wait without planning revenge to fill the waiting. The healers invented new ways to knit dragon wing. The priests brought bowls of cool water and put their hands in and held them there in silence until the water warmed, then took them out and said nothing. The cooks made soups that tasted like not quite home and sent them to anyone who had fingers strong enough to hold a spoon. A minister came to Mara with a stack of papers and asked which changes she wanted in the code because it needed to say more about fathers and fire and how a voice can break and still be duty. She read and red-inked and cried on the last page. Years passed, years honed, years life did. The consort died with her head in the emperor's lap, and the palace learned how quietly a planet can turn when a star goes out. Cathraz grew thin as only great powers can, edges sharper, eyes brighter with the particular clarity that comes when the body starts to go, and the soul decides to use what is left for aim. He leaned more on stone and less on pretense. He asked Mara to sit with him and talk about umbrellas because he liked to hear the sound of a human explaining something that protects without killing. She made him tea that tasted like consent. Humans arrived in more numbers but never with armies. They arrived with songs and math and stubbornness and broke in places and kept walking. Other species watched that and repositioned their contempt into wariness, then into investment, then into affection they would deny in court but not in kitchens. Mara's hair went gray like a blessing. The thread bracelet lay on its nail under the window and gathered dust, and she would brush it off and not put it on because promises dry and crack if you lock them to your wrist. Her back learned a new alphabet of pain. Her voice kept its thread, though sometimes it frayed on the high note at the end, and a dragon would hum it for her. When the emperor died, the sky filled with dragons so thick no one could see the sun for a little while, and people said the day was brighter than any day before because grief can do that. The dragons sang. The lullaby, old and young and battered and true, filled the palace until the stone hummed. The new empress, Shem of the Scar of Truth, made law that day. Keepers of breath become a recognized order with rights and pay and a say. There would be training, memorials, rest, pensions, and a promise enforced with claws and ink. No soothing voice would be weaponized without consent. The Vral sent a courier with a lousy poem about enemies respecting enemies, and the Empress let him keep his head because times had changed. Mara came to the end of her body the way she lived in it, in a room with a window, with a lullaby in the air, with someone's hand near hers but not squeezing too tight. She looked at the plant that refused to die and at the flag's edge in the sky slice and at the music box that had survived more heat than it should and said, "Don't stop singing when I stop. It's never about one voice." The dragons curled close and made the room into a cave and warmed it so gently the healers had to take off their cloaks. Night Wind laid his head half in the doorway because he did not fit but refused to be further. She closed her eyes. She was not alone. She had never been alone since the first scream in the nursery and the first hum that answered. She fell into quiet like a long breath out. The palace mourned with umbrellas open. The code gained a paragraph none of the ministers could read without stopping. The Empress put her claw on the window stone and felt the groove worn there by a human hand and said, "We do not let this go." The dragons brought the music box to the creche and placed it on a ledge and pressed the button together clumsily, until it broke, and a smith with hands big as grief fixed it and cried without apology because the screw was small, and his fingers were huge, and it took patience, and he had never been asked for that in all his life before the human came. Years added years. Empires forget and remember in a rhythm of their own. The lullabies traveled to places no Dracari soldiers had ever stood. On a station above a frozen world, a human tech sang to a thrumming reactor and it calmed. On a barge hauling ore through a dust veil, a Dracari crewman leaned his head against a bulkhead and hummed because his child had been born on the other side of the stars, and he could not feel the heat of her breath and he had to sing or break. In a Vral nursery, yes, they finally said the word where someone else could hear it. A teacher came across an old recording from a war and played it low, and the newborn settled. And that teacher filed no report because sometimes survival is disobedience. The story reached a planet with a sky the color of a bruise remembered. A woman there took in an infant not hers and hummed because she had nothing else to give. The infant lived. The woman said later she did not know the song. She knew the breath. A small human school on Tarthrian taught a class where children sat in a circle and learned to count while a dragon lay outside and breathed with them. The dragon felt silly and giant and loved and pretended he came for the shade. The teacher taught them dragons are not monsters, and monsters are mostly things we have not learned to breathe near yet. The Empress kept a place in the throne room with no chair. Visitors asked why. She said, "For the one who sits on the floor." They did not understand. They bowed anyway. There were still wars. There were still ships that arrived with knives in their signals. There were still nights when a baby's cry pulled someone's spine out and made it into a question mark. There were still mornings when the plant under the window needed water and no one had time, and it survived anyway because humans are not the only stubborn life. One winter, a word people use there now because the human had used it as shorthand for hard season, even on a world where seasons were fire and fire. The Vral returned with a ship that did not press knives to cities but unfolded gardens in orbit and asked the softest question they knew how. "Can we have a song?" The Empress said yes and sent a recording and then sent a human and a Dracari and a vessel of fragrant mist and an umbrella because she did not trust the Vral not to be themselves. The Vral listened, and for the first time in their writing they noted an emotion outside hunger and fear. They wrote it wrong. They called it pattern safety. It was good enough to not start a war. The dragons took apprentices of their own. Big bodies learned to be careful with smaller ones in a way that made the palace guards proud and confused at once. A dragon taught a human to hum while wearing a helmet that made him look like a beetle. The human taught the dragon to lower his head before entering a room. They both learned to wait at a door when someone said, "One moment." One day in a workshop under the palace, a smith finished the 10th replica of the music box. He had made 9 before it and sent them out to ships and nurseries and houses where people had lost something. He held the 10th in his palm like a heart. He pressed the button. The first notes came out clean. He cried again, the way big men cry when small things will not be bullied into working faster and then do their job anyway. Above him, in a square where lava once flowed and now children played under umbrellas for reasons other than war, a statue stood that did not look like any statue the Dracari had ever made. It was not a figure with weapons. It was a figure sitting cross-legged with hands on knees, head slightly tilted, eyes soft. At her feet lay 4 shapes like boulders with wings. Her mouth was open the smallest bit. If you stood close under certain winds and the sound rolled down from the creche and bounced off the banners correctly, you could swear you heard the statue sing. From time to time, caravans of pilgrims, Yes, that word came and sat around the statue and did not speak. Sometimes they hummed. No one made them. It was a law without punishment and a rite without priest. It spread because it felt like a window you could open in a room with no doors. Generations did what they do. They forgot and remembered and forgot. They fought the wrong wars and then the right ones. They wrote names and then the names wore smooth under fingers. They learned again to breathe on purpose. On a day of smoke tinted with blue under a sky full of dragons in summer, a human child asked her grandmother, "Why do we sing to the air?" The grandmother, who had been born on a ship and had learned to trust gravity as a loan, not a gift, said, "Because once the air learned our names and has not forgotten, and we sing to remember it knows us." On a night of aurora shaped like a river, far from the palace, on a ship where alarms had been trained to whisper when fear did not need help, a human nurse with a different name, and the same work touched the thread on her wrist and wound her music box, and said to a room full of incubators, "I am here." And she was, and in a battle far from hers a dragon breathed easier without knowing why. In the end, which is never the end, the galaxy did not crown a conqueror because conquerors fall. It did not raise a flag over a ruin and call it victory. It did not make a song mandatory. It learned something that takes longer than war to learn and outlasts it. Gentleness has teeth. Care is an armor you put on each morning and do not take off even when the call comes to burn. It learned that a human sitting on a floor with a music box can change how empires make laws and how dragons fly into death and why they come home. When the archive keepers tell the tale, they start in the palace built for roar and end with a room with a window. They talk about an emperor who learned umbrellas and an empress who wrote softness into law. They talk about 4 dragons and the names they chose, and the names they were called by someone who never said them out loud. They talk about a nurse who walked into heat and did not come out the same and did not want to. And across light years, in fields where radios used to carry only curses and orders, a lullaby moves the way rivers move under ice where no one can see, and it keeps moving even when the cold says stop. And it keeps moving because something behind it is stubborn and soft and very old and very new and irreducible to words except these. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.